Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The Show Me Institute is a research and educational organization dedicated to improving the quality of life in Missouri by advancing sensible, well-researched solutions to state and local policy issues. Institute scholars study public policy problems and develop proposals to increase economic opportunity. Those solutions are presented in written studies, briefing papers, and educational materials which help policymakers, the media, and the general public gain a better understanding of those issues. One of their scholars is policy analyst and attorney Patrick Ishmael. Mr. Ishmael was a leader on the team opposing the Aerotropolis proposal. He also writes about the need for photo ID for voters, tax credits, eliminating the corporate income tax, and healthcare issues in the state of Missouri. During law school, he was the election day director for Missouri's John McCain campaign, where he organized legal teams to prevent voter fraud. Patrick Ishmael, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just do a brief bio. Are you from St. Louis?
Originally, I'm from Kansas City. I moved
Missouri or?
Missouri side,
okay.
yeah.
So you're acceptable.
Where the Royals are from and the Chiefs. I moved here about 10 years ago for college. I went to St. Louis University and then went to St. Louis University Law School. Graduated from there and then kind of stuck around here and working for the Show Me Institute now. And at the Show Me Institute, I work with, as you said, healthcare issues. I work with tax credits. And on a daily basis, I'm looking at, what is good policy for the state? What is good policy for the state of Missouri? What's good policy for the region? And looking at it from a free market perspective. I think that a lot of really great stuff can happen in this region and in this state. And I think a lot of it, if you just let people pursue their dreams independently without a whole lot of government interference, I think a lot can really happen.
Good's a relative term. How do you determine what is good or not good for the people of the state of Missouri?
I think it's pretty easy. If they're able to pursue their economic objectives, we're very much in support of pursuing liberty at the Show Me Institute. And so whether it means economic liberty or other liberty, really we stick to the economic issues mainly, but for things like voter ID, ensuring that we have good governance in the state, ensuring that we have an efficient and effective government, and that people are getting what they want out of that government, and not having it distort or interfere with their lives unnecessarily. I think that is what's good for folks, is people being able to pursue what they want to do. And a lot of times that means being able to live their lives and pursue their economic objectives without a whole lot of interference from the government.
You mentioned photo ID for voters. Mm-hmm. What's the importance of that? Why? Apparently there are many people who simply think that this is a racist plot to disenfranchise minorities, and they're making a big deal out of that. So what's the reason that you think that this needs to be fought so hard?
Well, when I was working for the John McCain campaign, my job was to make sure that everyone knew what the law was, make sure that everyone who could vote was able to vote and able to vote very easily, mm-hmm. But also to make sure that people who shouldn't be voting weren't voting. And so that meant people had to know what the rules for identification are. And in Missouri, it's a pretty broad range of IDs that you can use. So an old utility bill qualifies, your driver's license qualifies, I think that photo ID is really necessary, and it's not an unreasonable imposition on people, because if you want to have good government, you have to make sure that those that are elected to office are properly there. And if you have fraud of 1%, 2%, how many elections does that swing? I think we can think of lots of elections that were decided by half a percentage point. And I was talking with a friend of mine on Twitter who is of a liberal persuasion. He's in a comparable kind of think tank as I am. And he said, I don't think it's really a problem. I think we're talking about probably 1% of the vote that is fraudulent. I think 1% of the vote being fraudulent is 1% too much. And particularly it's on those marginal races where it could go one way or another, where there's an incentive to vote fraudulently. I think that it's reasonable to expect. I don't think it's crazy to expect that people will demonstrate who they are, and I think the easiest way to do that is with a photo ID.
Okay. Now, as to these percentages that you're talking about, excuse me, I did a little research myself, and I came to find out that in Florida, in the year 2000, and Florida was a very controversial state between the George W. Bush and Albert Gore, who was running as the Democrat. That race was very controversial and very, very close. It was settled by 1/100th of 1% of the vote. There were 6 million votes approximately for president in the state of Florida. It came down to 537 votes that were more for George Bush than they were for Al Gore. Now, 1/100th of 1% would be about 600 votes. So if you only had that few people who were pretending to be somebody else or weren't allowed to vote, and if they all voted for George Bush, then I would suspect that the Democrats would be up in arms if they found that out.
I mean, I think on whatever side you're on, you should be very concerned about voter fraud. I can speak for myself that as a resident of St. Louis City, I've gone and I've voted in St. Louis City, and there was a primary that I went to. Walk up, I have my ID ready, and I tell them my name, and they're signing me in, and they haven't seen any of my identification whatsoever. And so, right there, that should really be kind of a red flag. You saw this in Washington, D.C. There's an organization called Project Veritas, and what they did was they walked into a ballot location, a voting location, and asked whether an Eric Holder had a ballot there. And the person who was behind the counter said, yes, we have it. This is Attorney General Eric Holder. Yes, we have it, and was going to present them with a ballot. And at that point, Project Veritas, if they wanted to commit a felony, could have taken that ballot and voted, but they politely excused themselves so they didn't violate the law. I think that's a huge red flag, that if you can get Eric Holder's ballot without showing any ID, having to do basically nothing, that we should all be concerned about our own votes, because our own votes could be diluted by fraud that could be as easy to commit as saying or asking for someone else when you're really not that person. And like I said, I've had a similar experience here in Missouri. This isn't just some isolated DC problem. This is a problem that I think we can all wrap our arms around and understand and appreciate, that in modern society, I think that a photo ID is kind of expected. And I think that you can put forward a proposal at the state level and say that we can get these IDs to you free of charge. I think that's reasonable. I think it's really important to allow people to vote. But it's also very important to make sure that people who are voting are legally voting, and those that are voting don't have their votes diluted by fraud.
I just find it interesting, the people who claim that this would be too much of a hardship for a handful of people not to acquire voter ID. If they spent half the energy that they're spending arguing in just helping these folks get an ID, the problem would be solved and they wouldn't need to argue anymore about it. And then those folks would have their voter ID. But it appears to me, and now this is going to be very controversial, that it appears to me that perhaps the reason that they don't want voter ID is because they're actually in the business of picking and choosing how they want the election to be swung.
Well, I can't speak to anybody else's intentions, obviously.
That's right.
What I would say is that this is not a gargantuan problem that can't be solved at a pretty quick rate. Denise Lieberman, who I debated with a couple weeks back, who's in support of not allowing for photo ID, said, and it was a really interesting remark that she made, and I didn't digest it until a little bit after, but she said that 89% of the population has a photo ID, which is a huge number of people, in fact, which means 11% don't have ID, which means, we can certainly get that, but 89%, you can hardly get 89% of people to agree on anything, and 89% have photo identification. I think that's probably possibly more than the number of people who have cable. And I think that when you have that sort of level of kind of buy-in to a certain system, I think it's not a crazy idea to have everyone buy into it for one of our most important rights and important right of voting.
Well, full disclosure, I am an election judge. I'm an election supervisor, and I will say that in the places, and I'm never at the same place twice, and in the places that I am in, it is a very, very, very rare day that somebody isn't actually already bringing out their driver's license or some other photo ID to put on the table before they're even asked. But we are trained never to ask for a photo ID. We're trained to ask for identification.
Right.
And you're right. By the way, an old utility bill is not good enough. It has to be a current utility bill. But the fact that, again, as I said, as few people who actually come to vote that don't have a photo ID, that those people could easily be helped to get the photo ID with less energy than it takes to argue not to have photo ID as a requirement to protect ballot integrity.
I would agree that I think that if we applied our energy toward getting people IDs rather than debating about something that it seems pretty straightforward. I don't think this is a crazy proposal. I think that you could get this done pretty quickly. But everyone has a right to disagree. That's one of the other great rights of this country is the First Amendment. I think photo IDs are a reasonable step.
I happened to see you on the JACO program, and I happened to see, actually I had already written months before I ever saw that program about this woman, Ms. Lieberman, and her belief that somehow it's a violation of Americans' fundamental rights if they have to show some sort of identification with a photo on it in order to vote. I don't get it, but let's move on to the next subject here, which would be your work with tax credits in the state of Missouri. Now, we're shooting this on the, what is today, the May the 22nd, and so the recent Missouri legislature session has just ended last Friday. This will be shown several weeks into the future, so things may be different. But as of right now, the session's over and tax credits have not been an issue, or at least there was nothing passed during this legislation, was there?
There wasn't anything certainly of note, and that is probably one of the most frustrating aspects, is that sometimes no news is actually good news with the legislature that we have, because there were two bills that came up that would have actually expanded some tax credits, created new tax credits, and that's completely the wrong direction to go. In fact, the only reform bill that came up, it passed through the Senate and didn't get a vote in the House, and it would have capped one of the biggest tax credits in the state. The historic preservation tax credit would have brought that from $140 million to $75 million. That would have been a great step forward. It wasn't a perfect bill by any stretch, but it didn't even get a hearing in the House. And that's unfortunate. That's really kind of a sad state of affairs, because tax credits, particularly in a development context, I think development tax credits are different than, shall we say, charitable tax credits like adoptions and that sort of thing. Development tax credits are always hawked as some sort of great economic driver, but so often it doesn't end up being the case. It's on an annual basis, you're looking at $300–400 million a year that are being spent by the state on projects that sometimes work, oftentimes don't work.
Why don't you pause there for just a second, because you just used the term that spent by the state. The state doesn't actually spend money, does it? It actually
foregoes.
It repays to certain people, doesn't it? In a sense. I mean, corporations go out and do. A builder goes and finds an old building in the city of St. Louis.
Sure.
It is determined this is a nice building. Let's rebuild it. Okay. So instead of the developer taking it upon himself to say, okay, fine, I will take the risk, as we do in a free economy, he says, I want the taxpayers of the state of Missouri to share in this project with me. I want them to actually put some money into this as well, because my project really isn't that profitable, and without their money, I can't really make a profit on this deal. Is that not what's going on here?
I think that's a fair description of what's going on. How it functions oftentimes differs from project to project. Sometimes the developers use a credit directly against their own taxes. Sometimes they can actually sell that credit and get cash for it. So whether we describe it as technically spending, or we describe it as foregoing of some tax revenue. At the end of the day is that it's money that would have been in state coffers but isn't in state coffers. And I think there are more effective ways of promoting economic growth. In particular, and this is a project that we're working on right now at the Show Me Institute, is taking the tax credit system, the development tax credit system, and swapping that out for an elimination of the corporate income tax. Because what we're putting out in tax credits is such a great number, such a high level of tax credits, that if we're going to do that, why don't we not pick winners and losers, and why don't we let all corporations in the state not pay a corporate income tax? I think income taxes are pretty destructive generally.
What is a corporate income tax? I mean, most people know they pay their income taxes. What's the difference between what you as an individual pay as an income tax and this corporate tax?
Well, there's a difference as far as the percentage that is taxed. The state in Missouri, the state of Missouri taxes 6.25% of the earnings that Missouri corporations generate. And I think that you can eliminate that rather than saying, and a lot of times you have tax credits that are just being applied to corporations anyway. Why not, instead of picking winners and losers, just say no corporate income tax at all? I think it would make us more competitive. There aren't a whole lot of states that are doing it right now, which means I think we have a competitive advantage in that particular field. So it's not unlike a personal income tax. It's just an income tax. It's a tax on capital of corporations.
So you said that the rate is a little over 6% on corporations.
It is.
And what is it for individuals, for you?
It's graduated. It's 6% on an individual basis, but it builds up from I think 1%, 1.5% for the first $10,000 of income, but it's about 6% for individuals.
So then, now corporations are really owned by people, and so when their money gets distributed to people who are not corporations, do they tax it again?
Well, I mean, you're right. People do make up their corporation. So when you receive your paycheck from a corporation,
No, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the owners. When the owners take
are you
money,
talking about dividends?
Yeah, well, dividends, or they're just cashing out.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are lots of transactions.
Taking retained earnings and turning it into personal money, or say, for example, in a like an S corporation or some other form of small corporation in which people are actually taking their paying individual taxes on their corporation as opposed to paying corporate taxes. Well, and I'm now a little out of my depth because I'm not an accountant, but I understand that there's all these little tricks that are going on in the accounting field in terms of where monies are being billed to various people, whether it's at the corporate level or coming out of their personal income.
Well, and I think any way that you can simplify the taxing system, I think is a better taxing system anyway. If you can make the system predictable, and where you don't have a state deciding, well, this is going to be the hot new industry. You saw that with Aerotropolis, where all of a sudden Aerotropolis was this grand idea. And it is a grand idea. The problem is it's not a practical idea, and it certainly wasn't based in any sort of
Well, for people who
research.
aren't aware, explain Aerotropolis and then what the problems were with that.
Sure. Aerotropolis was a $500 million tax credit project that was going to be benefiting the St. Louis airport, St. Louis Lambert. And it changed a few times over the course of the session, but eventually it got whittled down to about $360 million, most of which was going to go toward building new warehouses or retrofitting old warehouses for this gigantic international trade project. It was alternatively named the China Hub because China was going to be one of the biggest partners in it, and it was built almost as just like a cure-all for all of the problems that St. Louis has. That it was going to put us on a new footing. That all we had to do was put out these tax credits, and they would be swallowed up, and we'd make lots and lots of money, and it would renew the St. Louis area. It was compared to like the Eads Bridge, and we have to get these bridges up at the turn of the century in the 1900s, 1800s to compete with other cities. It was compared at that same level. And when you looked at the research that had been done, you kind of realized that there hasn't been really that much research done into this project to justify spending this kind of money. So for instance, they were talking about shipping our beef to China. Well, it turns out our beef is illegal in China. There's no way that we can ship our beef to China because they have a ban on American beef. And it's little problems like that that just kind of add up over time. And you get into folks who have already benefited from state tax incentive programs, also benefiting from this program, just sort of layering them on, one on top of the other. And it really looked like a kind of a boondoggle. And
this plan, as I understand it, was from the highest levels of the political establishment in the state of Missouri. Is that correct?
It was.
Right. And you're saying that the people at the highest level of the political levels in Missouri were unaware of what the law was in terms of the what you just mentioned, beef.
I can't speak to what they did or did not know. What I can say is what the law was and what the law is and what was being promoted simultaneously to what the law is and was. And what was being stated publicly about the beef aspect in particular was incorrect. And you can assess that for what it is.
So that was outgoing.
Outgoing.
That was outgoing. Now, There was supposed to be some incoming stuff, right? And that was coming from China?
China.
Basically?
There was some talk of it expanding to a more international aspect, but China was the real player.
So they were expecting the people of St. Louis to buy up huge amounts of Chinese goods? Is that?
It would come into the airport, whether it ended up staying in the airport and staying in the region, or whether it got spun out through rail and other ways to other parts of the country.
Because I just heard a discussion, what was it, like about a week or two ago, in which the St. Louis city ports and other ports along the river in the St. Louis area are talking similarly about having stuff come up the river to St. Louis, and then suddenly it's going to be shipped from here on our vast interstate highway system.
I mean, I can't really speak to that particular. You're talking just generally speaking that people they would just be going
things
through
that come by boat rather than by airplane. The same sort of talk.
Well, the
city of St. Louis is wanting to spend a bunch of money improving their port. Jefferson County was talking about spending $100 million building a whole new port to do all this on a speculative idea that there are products coming which need to be shipped on Interstate 55, 70, or 44.
Well, and I know that's been talked about in the past by former members of the Department of Economic Development about how important the port is, to what extent we ought to be spending that kind of money and sort of bang for our buck we'll get out of that. I don't know. I haven't really done the research on that, but I think that just like with Aerotropolis, unless it's well researched, unless you can never really guarantee anything, but state with some level of probability, reasonable probability that's supported by facts, that this is going to be a good investment of taxpayer dollars, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And that,
especially with other people's money, like taxpayers.
Well, right, exactly. I think the private market is more than capable of resolving a lot of these economic opportunities, taking advantage of those opportunities. And, you can go back to tax credits and compare that to corporate income tax and say, who do I trust more to run the economy? The legislature, the governor, or do I believe in the people who are on the ground transacting business on a daily basis, have knowledge of the things that they're investing in, personal knowledge? I'd rather have that money stick with them and have them invest it because, you can have good legislatures, bad legislatures, good governors, bad governors. But at the end of the day, a businessman is still going to be a businessman, and he's still not going to want to make bad investments. And I think we all benefit when we allow businesses to flourish in our state.
Here in the last 4 minutes, and we're down to the last 4 minutes here, are there any areas that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about?
Well, one of the areas that I work with is healthcare, and in Missouri, they're going to be taking a referendum to the people that will.
When?
It's either going to be, I think it's probably going to be November.
November 2012.
Right, okay. This year. That will allow them to decide whether or not the governor can unilaterally implement an Obamacare exchange in the state. I think that they're probably going to give that the same sort of exclamation point as they did with Prop C in 2010, where
which was
it was basically same of the people saying that they don't want Obamacare.
Okay.
And I expect them to say, no, the governor cannot unilaterally implement an Obamacare exchange, which I think.
What is an exchange?
It's a marketplace whereby to gain access to it, you have to have a certain minimum coverage requirement, and the government pretty much dictates what all the insurance plans in that exchange look like. So it's a big government kind of takeover of the industry where you still have private market participants, but they have to fit a certain government regulated criterion. Mm-hmm. And so there's that, and I'm happy to see that passed. But one little notice bill was a bill called the Volunteer Health Services Act. And the Volunteer Health Services Act would have allowed out-of-state physicians and out-of-state dentists and optometrists to come into the state of Missouri and to provide their services for free without any burdensome licensing requirements. Because if you're a doctor in one place, you're really a doctor in another place. The problem that some organizations are facing is that there's this licensing barrier, there's this cost and this burden to get into the state to provide services. And what the bill would have done would have removed basically all of those barriers. It passed through the House, it was slightly changed in the Senate, and then the two sides couldn't work out a deal between the two of them before the session ended. And that's really disappointing. It's a real shame, because I think that we need to be proactive about healthcare issues in the state of Missouri. And when you have an opportunity to allow for volunteers, for free actors to provide care to the neediest of our people, we ought to be allowing for that. We ought to be taking advantage of that opportunity. And that's what that bill presented, but unfortunately didn't pass out. So healthcare is another issue that I deal with. Corporate income tax credits, and voter ID is the other, and we've talked about all those
yes,
already.
Yeah, we have.
So.
On the voter ID, there has been discussion that this is not a problem. Mm-hmm. And yet, in the papers recently, there was an article in which there is, I believe that in Florida, that they found 57,000 dead people still on the rolls mm-hmm. in Florida. There was another article about a gentleman who, in the state of Oregon, voted for his dead son, in addition to voting for himself. When I hear Mr. Jaco and the program that you were on talking about something that hasn't occurred since 1937, it seems disingenuous to me, and you got about 30 seconds.
What I would say is that I don't think we should be waiting for felonies to be prosecuted to recognize that a problem exists. And I think that you see it with Project Veritas in DC. I saw it personally. You need to be asking people for identification. I think photo identification is a reasonable requirement. 89% of people, by people who, and that's given by people who are against photo IDs, already have photo IDs. I don't think it's a stretch to say that photo ID should be a required element of voting, and I think that we can get photo ID to everyone.
Thank you very much for your insights into various issues with the state of Missouri. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Patrick Ishmael. He is a policy analyst with the Show Me Institute. I want to thank you for all listening to what the man had to say, and we look forward to having you back with us the next time.